the criminal organization known to law enforcement as La Cosa Nostra, or Our Thing, had by the 1970s established itself as the most powerful criminal syndicate in the United States, operating through 5 distinct families which controlled virtually every major racket in New York City. These families, known collectively as the 5 Families, were the Gambino, Genovese, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno organizations, each named for the boss who had consolidated power within their respective groups during the reorganization of the American Mafia in the decades following Prohibition. By the late 1970s, these 5 families exercised near-complete control over construction, garbage collection, the garment industry, labor unions, loan sharking, gambling operations, and drug trafficking throughout the 5 boroughs of New York and the wider metropolitan area. The Gambino family, based primarily in Brooklyn and Queens, was the largest and most powerful of the 5 families, with an estimated membership of over 300 made men and several thousand associates by 1976. The Genovese family, operating throughout Manhattan and the Bronx, was regarded as the most disciplined and secretive of the organizations, while the Lucchese family controlled extensive rackets in the garment district and at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens. The Colombo family, though smaller and plagued by internal conflicts, maintained significant operations in Brooklyn, and the Bonanno family, which had faced severe organizational problems following a major infiltration by federal agents in the late 1970s, nonetheless continued to operate profitable trafficking networks. At the helm of these families in the late 1970s and early 1980s stood a group of men who had risen through decades of criminal activity to assume leadership positions within La Cosa Nostra. Paul Castellano, born Constantino. Paul Castellano, on the 26th of June 1915, in the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn, controlled the Gambino family. Anthony Salerno, known as Fat Tony, served as the front boss of the Genovese family, while the actual power rested with Vincent Gigante. Antonio Corallo, also known as Tony Ducks, led the Lucchese family, while Carmine Persico controlled the Colombo organization, and Philip Rastelli nominally headed the Bonanno family, though much of the operational control rested with his underboss, Joseph Massino. And it was within this framework of organized criminal enterprise, generating combined annual revenues estimated at over $1 billion, that the Federal Bureau of Investigation would ultimately wage the most comprehensive assault on La Cosa Nostra in the history of American law enforcement. To understand how the FBI succeeded in dismantling these families, it is worth examining the historical development of the American Mafia and the legal frameworks which had previously protected it from prosecution. The origins of La Cosa Nostra's dominance in New York can be traced to the period of Prohibition, which began with the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution in January 1920. The amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcoholic beverages throughout the United States, creating an immediate and enormous market for illegal alcohol, which criminal organizations moved swiftly to exploit. In New York City, Italian-American gangs, many of which had previously operated small-scale protection rackets and gambling operations, began importing and distributing bootleg liquor on a massive scale, generating revenues which transformed them from neighborhood street gangs into sophisticated criminal enterprises. This expansion led to violent conflicts over territory and control of the lucrative bootlegging trade, culminating in the Castellammares War of 1930 to 1931, a bloody conflict between rival factions which saw dozens of gangsters killed throughout New York. The war concluded with the assassination of Giuseppe Masseria on the 15th of April 1931 and the subsequent killing of Salvatore Maranzano on the 10th of September 1931, leaving Charles Lucky Luciano as the most powerful Italian-American gangster in New York. Luciano, recognizing that the cycle of gang wars was both unprofitable and likely to bring unwanted law enforcement attention, reorganized the various Italian-American criminal groups in New York into a more stable structure. He established what became known as the Commission, a governing body composed of the bosses of the major families, which would mediate disputes, authorize murders, and coordinate criminal activities to avoid conflicts. Under this system, which was formalized in the early 1930s, New York's Italian-American organized crime was divided into 5 families, each controlling specific territories and rackets, and each represented on the commission alongside bosses from other cities, including Chicago, Buffalo, and Philadelphia. Following the repeal of Prohibition with the ratification of the 21st Amendment, in December 1933, the families shifted their focus to other criminal enterprises, including labor racketeering, extortion, loan sharking, gambling, and eventually narcotics trafficking. The organizational structure established by Luciano proved remarkably resilient, and by the 1950s, La Cosa Nostra had achieved near-total dominance over organized crime in the United States. Despite this expansion, federal law enforcement efforts against the Mafia remained minimal for decades. J. Edgar Hoover, who served as director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation from 1924 until 1972, was notoriously reluctant to acknowledge the existence of organized crime, preferring to focus the Bureau's resources on bank robberies, kidnappings, and later on, communist subversion. Hoover's position was that organized crime was a local matter, best handled by state and municipal police forces, though many contemporaries and historians since have suggested that his reluctance stemmed from a fear that investigating the Mafia would expose corruption within law enforcement agencies and potentially implicate the FBI itself. This began to change following an incident on the 14th of November 1957, when local police in the small town of Appalachian in upstate New York stumbled upon a meeting of over 60 senior Mafia figures from across the United States who had gathered at the rural estate of Joseph Barbara. The discovery of the Appalachian meeting and the subsequent flight of dozens of well-dressed men through the surrounding woods as police arrived provided undeniable evidence that a national organized crime network existed, forcing Hoover to acknowledge what many local law enforcement agencies had known for decades. However, even with this acknowledgement, federal efforts against the Mafia remained limited throughout the 1960s. A significant breakthrough came in 1963 when Joseph Valachi, a soldier in the Genovese family, became the first member of La Cosa Nostra to publicly testify about the organization's structure and operations before the United States Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Valachi's testimony, delivered over several days in September and October 1963, provided detailed information about initiation rituals, the commission, family structures, and specific criminal activities, giving federal investigators their first comprehensive understanding of how the Mafia functioned as an organization. Despite Valachi's revelations, prosecutors struggled to secure convictions against senior Mafia figures throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s. Traditional criminal statutes required proof that a specific individual had personally committed a specific crime, but the hierarchical structure of La Cosa Nostra allowed bosses to insulate themselves from direct involvement in criminal activities by issuing orders through intermediaries. Proving that a boss had ordered a murder or authorized a criminal enterprise was extraordinarily difficult when the boss himself never appeared at the scene of the crime and rarely, if ever, discussed such matters in the presence of anyone outside his immediate inner circle. The passage of the Racketeer, Influenced, and Corrupt Organizations Act, commonly known as RICO, on the 15th of October 1970, provided federal prosecutors with a powerful new legal tool. The statute made it illegal to acquire or operate a legitimate business through a pattern of racketeering activity, which was defined as committing at least 2 acts from a list of 35 specified crimes, called predicate acts, within a 10-year period. Critically, RICO allowed prosecutors to charge individuals with running a criminal enterprise even if they had not personally committed the underlying crimes, so long as evidence demonstrated they directed or benefited from the criminal activities of the organization. Convictions under RICO carried severe penalties, including up to 20 years imprisonment per count and the forfeiture of any assets derived from the criminal enterprise. However, in the decade following RICO's passage, federal prosecutors achieved only limited success in applying the statute against organized crime. The law was complex and untested, and many prosecutors remained uncertain about how to construct cases under its provisions. Additionally, gathering evidence of a pattern of racketeering activity required extensive investigations involving surveillance, wiretaps, and cooperating witnesses, resources which the FBI had not traditionally devoted to organized crime cases. Thus, by the late 1970s, despite decades of mafia dominance and the existence of powerful legal tools in the form of the RICO statute, the FBI had yet to secure a single major conviction of a sitting boss of any of the 5 families. La Cosa Nostra continued to operate with relative impunity throughout New York City, generating enormous profits and exercising influence over legitimate industries, labor unions, and even elements of local government. This was the situation which would begin to change as a new generation of FBI agents and federal prosecutors entered the field in the late 1970s and early 1980s, armed with developing surveillance technologies and a determination to apply RICO in ways their predecessors had not attempted. The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Organized Crime Division in New York underwent significant restructuring beginning in 1979, when the agency established specialized squads dedicated to targeting each of the 5 families individually. Prior to this reorganization, FBI efforts against the Mafia had been scattered and unfocused, with agents pursuing various leads without a coordinated strategy. Under the new structure, separate squads were assigned to each family, with the C-16 squad focusing on the Gambino family, the C-5 squad on the Bonanno family, and similar dedicated units for the Genovese, Lucchese, and Colombo organizations, all operating from the FBI's New York field office at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan. The foundations for these expanded efforts had been laid in part by an extraordinary undercover operation which had concluded just before the reorganization. Joseph Dominic Pistone, an FBI agent, had infiltrated the Bonanno family beginning in 1976 under the alias Donnie Brasco, posing as a jewel thief and gradually working his way into the confidence of family members. Over the course of nearly 6 years, Pistone had gathered extensive intelligence on the internal workings of the Bonanno family, attending meetings, participating in criminal activities under FBI supervision, and documenting the family's structure and operations in unprecedented detail. When the operation concluded in July 1981, Pistone's work had provided federal investigators with the most comprehensive inside view of La Cosa Nostra ever obtained, though the full extent of this intelligence would not be utilized in prosecutions for several more years. The expanded investigative effort received additional impetus with the appointment of Jules Bonavolonta as chief of the FBI's Organized Crime Section in New York in 1980. Bonavolonta, a career FBI agent who had spent years investigating traditional organized crime, was a strong advocate for the aggressive use of electronic surveillance and the systematic application of the RICO statute against the mafia's leadership. Under his direction, the FBI began submitting applications for court-authorized wiretaps and bugs targeting the 5 families, a tactic which had previously been used only sporadically in organized crime investigations. Simultaneously, the appointment of Rudolph William Louis Giuliani as United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York in June 1983 provided the prosecutorial leadership necessary to translate investigative work into successful prosecutions. Giuliani, a former federal prosecutor who had previously served in the Justice Department in Washington, made organized crime prosecution a central priority of his tenure. He assembled a team of aggressive prosecutors, including Michael Chertoff and Barbara Jones, who were willing to pursue complex RICO cases despite the legal uncertainties and resource demands such prosecutions entailed. In the years following the reorganization, the dedicated FBI squads began achieving incremental successes, securing convictions of soldiers and capos within the families for specific crimes such as extortion, loan sharking, and hijacking. These smaller prosecutions served multiple purposes, as they not only removed individual criminals from the streets, but also created opportunities to flip defendants into cooperating witnesses who could provide testimony about higher-ranking family members. The development of informant networks proved particularly valuable, as cooperating witnesses could explain the significance of coded conversations captured on surveillance devices and provide context which transformed seemingly innocuous statements into evidence of criminal activity. However, Pistone's work was involved in various incidents which provided valuable intelligence on the internal workings of the Bonanno family and their associates, though the full extent of this information would not be utilized for several more years. The groundwork was being laid, but the major prosecutions, which would ultimately dismantle the family's leadership, remained several years in the future. As these early investigative efforts were developing in the late 1970s and early 1980s, the bosses of the 5 families were simultaneously consolidating their power and engaging in increasingly bold criminal enterprises, which would ultimately provide federal prosecutors with the evidence needed to pursue RICO indictments. Paul Castellano assumed control of the Gambino family in 1976 following the death of Carlo Gambino, who had designated his brother-in-law rather than his own underboss Aniello della Croce to succeed him. Castellano, who preferred to be called Paul rather than his given name Constantino, had spent decades in the Gambino organization overseeing its legitimate business interests and distancing himself from the street-level violence which characterized much of the family's activities. Upon assuming leadership, he moved the family's focus increasingly toward white-collar crimes, particularly construction industry racketeering, concrete supply bid rigging, and labor union infiltration, operations which generated enormous revenues while attracting less law enforcement attention than traditional organized crime activities such as gambling and loan sharking. Under Castellano's leadership, the Gambino family established effective control over the concrete industry in New York City through an arrangement which became known as the Concrete Club. This involved coordination with other families to divide up major construction contracts, with the families agreeing not to compete against each other for specific projects and instead submitting artificially inflated bids, which guaranteed substantial profits regardless of which company won the contract. The system operated through control of the concrete workers' unions and the Teamsters locals, which transported concrete throughout the city, allowing the families to essentially tax every major construction project in New York. Estimates suggested this arrangement cost developers and ultimately the public hundreds of millions of dollars in inflated construction costs throughout the early 1980s. Castellano maintained his residence at 177 Benedict Road in the Tot Hill neighborhood of Staten Island, a white mansion so conspicuous that it became known colloquially as the White House. The estate featured extensive security systems, manicured grounds, and accommodations befitting Castellano's self-image as a businessman rather than a gangster. He conducted much of his business from the residence, meeting with capos and associates in a first-floor meeting room, though he also maintained an office at a meat processing company in Brooklyn, which served as a front for family operations. Despite Castellano's efforts to modernize the family's operations, tensions existed within the Gambino organization between his faction and a group of traditionalists led by Aniello della Croce, who controlled crews in Manhattan and continued to engage in more conventional organized crime activities, including gambling, hijacking, and drug trafficking. John Joseph Gotti Jr., a capo in Della Croce's faction, operated out of the Bergen Hunt and Fish Club in the Ozone Park neighborhood of Queens and maintained an aggressive, violent approach to criminal enterprise, which stood in stark contrast to Castellano's business-oriented style. The Genovese family, meanwhile, maintained its position as perhaps the most disciplined and secretive of the five families. Anthony Salerno, known as Fat Tony, served as the public face of the family, operating from the Palmer Boys Social Club at 416 East 115th Street in East Harlem. However, the actual power within the Genovese organization rested with Vincent Louis Gigante, who had assumed control following the imprisonment of previous bosses, but who went to extraordinary lengths to conceal his leadership role. Gigante began in the early 1970s to feign mental illness, wandering the streets of Greenwich Village in a bathrobe and muttering to himself, attending meetings in his pajamas and cultivating a reputation as mentally unfit to stand trial. This elaborate deception, which would continue for over 2 decades, was designed to prevent law enforcement from targeting him as the family's true leader. Under Gigante's actual direction and Salerno's nominal leadership, the Genovese family controlled extensive labor racketeering operations throughout the New York metropolitan area. The family maintained influence over numerous Teamsters locals, the Longshoremen's Union, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, and various construction trade unions, positions which allowed them to extract payoffs from employers, embezzle from union pension funds, and control the awarding of contracts. Additionally, the Genovese family exercised near total control over the Fulton Fish Market in Lower Manhattan, where seafood distributors were forced to pay tribute to family-connected companies for the privilege of operating, and where union positions were effectively bought and sold through Genovese intermediaries. The family's income from legitimate industries, extortion, and traditional racketeering was estimated at over $100 million annually by the early 1980s. The Genovese organization's penetration of the garbage collection industry in New York and New Jersey proved particularly lucrative, with the family controlling the Trade Waste Association, which divided up commercial garbage collection routes among member companies, all of which paid tribute to the family. Antonio Corallo controlled the Lucchese family from his base in the Garment District of Manhattan, where the organization had established dominance over the trucking companies which transported clothing between manufacturers and retailers. This control allowed the Lucchese family to effectively tax the entire garment industry, as manufacturers were forced to use Lucchese-controlled trucking companies which charged inflated rates for their services. Corallo, who was known as Tony Ducks due to his success in avoiding criminal convictions despite numerous arrests over the years, maintained a relatively low profile compared to some of his counterparts, conducting business from his Jaguar automobile as he was driven around the city by his trusted chauffeur and underboss, Salvatore Santoro. The Lucchese family also maintained extensive operations at John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, where family-connected workers and union officials facilitated large-scale cargo theft operations. High-value shipments were identified through inside information and then either stolen directly from airport warehouses or hijacked in transit, generating millions of dollars annually for the family. Perhaps the most notorious of these thefts occurred in December 1978 when associates of the Lucchese family, working with members of other crews, stole approximately $5 million in cash and $875,000 in jewelry from a Lufthansa Airlines cargo building at the airport, though this particular operation resulted in numerous murders as the participants were systematically eliminated to prevent them from becoming informants. Beyond these operations, Corallo maintained the family's traditional involvement in labor racketeering, controlling locals of the Painters Union, the Window Cleaners Union, and various construction trade unions, positions which paralleled the Genovese family's influence in the labor movement, and which occasionally led to disputes between the families over jurisdictional boundaries. Carmine Persico led the Colombo family, though his leadership was complicated by his frequent incarcerations and by violent internal conflicts which had plagued the family since the early 1960s. Persico, who was known as Junior or the Snake, had participated in the Colombo family's internal war of the early 1960s and had emerged as boss in 1973, but his leadership was interrupted by various criminal prosecutions, which saw him spend much of the 1970s and early 1980s fighting charges or serving sentences. Despite these difficulties, Persico maintained control over the family through loyal capos and associates who acted on his behalf, and the organization continued to operate profitable loan sharking, gambling, and extortion operations primarily in Brooklyn. The Colombo family was the smallest and weakest of the five families by the early 1980s, with an estimated membership of fewer than 100 made men. Internal divisions dating back to the assassination attempt on Joseph Colombo in 1971 continued to create instability, and the family lacked the extensive infiltration of legitimate industries which characterized the operations of the Gambino, Genovese, and Lucchese organizations. Nonetheless, the family maintained its seat on the commission and participated in the coordinated criminal activities of La Cosa Nostra. The Bonanno family occupied a peculiar position among the five families in the early 1980s. The organization had been removed from the commission in the 1960s following a power struggle which had threatened to ignite a broader war among the families, and it had only recently been readmitted to the governing body. More significantly, the family had been severely damaged by the infiltration of FBI agent Joseph Pistone, whose presence within the organization from 1976 to 1981 had compromised numerous operations and members. When Pistone's true identity was revealed in 1981, several Bonanno members who had vouched for him or worked closely with him were murdered by the family leadership to punish them for the security breach. Philip Rastelli served as the nominal boss of the Bonanno family, but much of the operational control rested with Joseph Charles Massino, a capo who controlled crews in Queens and who was regarded as one of the more capable leaders within the organization. Under Massino's direction, the Bonanno family maintained involvement in drug trafficking, loan sharking, and illegal gambling operations, though the family's revenue and influence was substantially less than those of the Gambino or Genovese organizations. Across all five families, the early 1980s represented a period of substantial profitability and relative stability. The Commission continued to function as a governing body which mediated disputes, authorized murders, and coordinated activities to prevent conflicts between the families. Meetings of the Commission were held periodically at various locations throughout New York, with the bosses or their representatives gathering to discuss matters of mutual concern and to enforce the rules which had governed La Cosa Nostra since its reorganization in the 1930s. The family's penetration of legitimate industries had reached unprecedented levels. In addition to construction, concrete, garbage collection, and the garment industry, La Cosa Nostra maintained influence over significant portions of the food distribution industry, the private sanitation industry, various entertainment venues, and numerous labor unions. This influence allowed the families to generate enormous revenues from activities which were difficult for law enforcement to characterize as clearly illegal, as much of the income came from inflated prices, rigged bids, and sweetheart contracts, rather than from obviously criminal enterprises such as drug trafficking or extortion. The cash generated by these operations created its own challenges. The families maintained elaborate money laundering operations, often investing illegal proceeds in legitimate businesses, real estate, and offshore accounts. Much of the money was simply stored in cash, hidden in apartments, safe deposit boxes, and other locations throughout New York. The volume of currency was such that counting and storing it became a logistical problem requiring dedicated personnel, and these were were only the most visible operations of the five families, as intelligence gathered by the FBI suggested that their combined annual revenues exceeded $1 billion by the early 1980s, making them collectively one of the most profitable criminal enterprises in the world history. The families employed thousands of individuals, controlled hundreds of businesses, and exercised influence over major sectors of New York's economy, all while maintaining the code of silence known as omerta, which had traditionally prevented members from cooperating with law enforcement. The very boldness of these operations, conducted with seeming impunity throughout New York City and beyond, would prove to be the undoing of the families as federal investigators began developing a comprehensive strategy to target all five families simultaneously using the RICO statute in ways which had never before been attempted. In 1983, the FBI and the United States Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York made a strategic decision which would alter the trajectory of organized crime prosecution in America. Rather than continuing to pursue individual members of the five families for specific crimes, federal prosecutors determined to construct a single massive case, targeting the commission itself as a criminal enterprise under the RICO statute. The theory was audacious in its scope and unprecedented in its ambition, as it proposed to charge the bosses of multiple families not merely with ordering specific criminal acts, but with participating in a decades-long conspiracy to operate an illegal organization which existed for the purpose of committing crimes. The architect of this strategy was Rudolph Giuliani, who had taken office as United States Attorney in June 1983 with a mandate to pursue organized crime aggressively. Giuliani assembled a prosecution team which included Michael Chertoff, who would serve as lead prosecutor, along with Gil Childers, John Savarez, and other experienced attorneys who had worked on previous organized crime cases. The team recognized that successfully prosecuting the commission would require evidence not merely of individual criminal acts, but of a coordinated pattern of racketeering activity spanning years and involving multiple defendants, evidence which could only be obtained through extensive electronic surveillance. Federal investigators had already been conducting surveillance operations against individual family members for several years, with limited success. However, in late 1983, the FBI succeeded in obtaining court authorization to install listening devices in several locations, which would prove critical to building the commission case. The most significant of these was a bug placed in the Jaguar automobile regularly used by Antonio Corallo, the boss of the Lucchese family. FBI agents working at night installed a sophisticated transmitter in the dashboard of the vehicle in early 1983, and for the next 18 months, the device recorded hundreds of hours of conversations as Corallo was driven around New York conducting family business. The Jaguar bug captured Corallo discussing commission meetings, the concrete bid rigging arrangements, labor union infiltration, and numerous other criminal activities in extraordinary detail. Critically, the recordings demonstrated not merely that Corallo was involved in criminal activity, but that he was coordinating with other families through the commission structure, precisely the pattern of behavior which RICO was designed to prosecute. The transcripts of these conversations would ultimately form a substantial portion of the evidence presented at trial. Simultaneously, the FBI installed listening devices at other locations, frequented by family bosses and their associates. A bug placed at the Casa Storta restaurant at 102 East 109th Street in Manhattan captured conversations involving members of multiple families who met there to discuss business. Another device was installed at the Palmer Boys Social Club in East Harlem, the headquarters of Anthony Salerno, where commission meetings were occasionally held and where various family leaders discussed matters of mutual interest. The legal process for obtaining authorization to install these devices was complex and time-consuming. Federal law required that investigators demonstrate probable cause that specific crimes were being committed at the locations to be surveilled, and that normal investigative techniques had proven insufficient to gather evidence. Applications for Title III wiretap authorizations, name for the section of federal law which governed electronic surveillance, required extensive affidavits documenting the criminal activities under investigation and the reasons why surveillance was necessary. These applications were submitted to federal judges who reviewed the materials and determined whether to grant authorization, often imposing strict limits on the duration of surveillance and the types of conversations which could be recorded. Between 1983 and 1985, the FBI accumulated over 600 hours of recordings from bugs and wiretaps targeting the 5 families. The sheer volume of material required teams of agents and translators to review the tapes, many of which included conversations in Italian or Sicilian dialect, and to identify segments which contained evidence of criminal activity. The recordings were then transcribed, indexed, and analyzed to identify patterns of behavior and to connect specific statements to known criminal acts. In addition to electronic surveillance, federal investigators worked to develop cooperating witnesses who could provide testimony about the commission's structure and activities. Angelo Leonardo, the former underboss of the Cleveland crime family, had agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in 1983 following his conviction on drug trafficking charges. Leonardo provided detailed information about how the commission functioned, including his own attendance at commission meetings and his knowledge of how the governing body mediated disputes and authorized major decisions. Similarly, Jimmy Fratiano, a former acting boss of the Los Angeles crime family, who had become a government witness in 1977, offered testimony about the Commission's role in coordinating activities among families in different cities. The decision to indict the Commission itself, rather than simply charging individual bosses with specific crimes, represented a fundamental shift in prosecutorial strategy. Previous organized crime cases had focused on proving that a defendant committed a particular murder, robbery, or act of extortion. The Commission case would instead attempt to prove that the defendants had participated in an ongoing criminal enterprise, with the enterprise itself being the Commission and the predicate acts being the various crimes committed on behalf of or at the direction of that governing body. If successful, the prosecution would establish that merely participating in the Commission constituted a RICO violation, regardless of whether prosecutors could prove that a specific defendant had personally committed any particular crime. The scope of the investigation created coordination challenges within the FBI itself. The various squads targeting individual families had developed their own cases and their own informants, and pooling resources for a single massive prosecution required unprecedented cooperation among units which had historically operated independently. Jules Bonavolonta, as chief of the organized crime section, worked to facilitate this coordination, convening regular meetings of squad supervisors and ensuring that intelligence was shared across investigative teams. Prosecutors also faced the challenge of constructing an indictment which would clearly articulate the Commission's role as a criminal enterprise while avoiding overwhelming the jury with excessive detail. The final indictment would need to specify the predicate acts which constituted the pattern of racketeering activity, name the defendants and their roles within the enterprise, and explain how the Commission functioned as an ongoing criminal conspiracy. Legal precedents for RICO prosecutions remained limited in the early 1980s, and prosecutors recognized that they would need to educate judges and jurors about both the legal theory underlying RICO and the specific structure of La Cosa Nostra. Consequently, by early 1985, federal prosecutors had accumulated sufficient evidence from surveillance operations, informant testimony, and documentary records to proceed with indictments, though the scope of what they intended to charge would not become apparent until the 25th of February 1985, when a federal grand jury in Manhattan returned indictments against the bosses of 4 of the 5 families, charging them with operating a criminal enterprise through the Commission and naming specific acts of murder, extortion, labor racketeering, and bid rigging as predicate offenses under RICO. While prosecutors were preparing the Commission case indictments in late 1984 and early 1985, circumstances on the streets of New York were shifting in ways which would provide additional leverage for the government's efforts. On the 16th of December 1985, at approximately 5:25 in the evening, Paul Castellano and his newly appointed underboss, Thomas Bilotti, arrived at Spark Steakhouse at 210 East 46th Street in Manhattan for a previously arranged dinner meeting. The restaurant, located in Midtown Manhattan near Grand Central Terminal, was a popular establishment frequented by business executives and professionals, and Castellano had chosen it as a neutral location for the meeting. As Bilotti parked Castellano's Lincoln Continental at the curb in front of the restaurant, 3 men dressed in identical long coats and fur hats approached the vehicle from different directions. The men opened fire simultaneously as Castellano stepped out of the car. 6 shots struck Castellano in the head and torso, killing him instantly. Bilotti, who had exited the driver's side and was moving around the vehicle, was shot 4 times and collapsed on the street. The entire incident lasted less than 30 seconds, and the shooters disappeared into the early evening crowds on East 46th Street before witnesses could provide detailed descriptions to the police, who arrived minutes later. John Gotti had observed the assassination from a car parked across the street. After confirming that both Castellano and Bilotti were dead, Gotti was driven away from the scene. Within hours, he convened a meeting of Gambino family capos at a location in Lower Manhattan, where he announced that he had assumed control of the family and that the murders had been necessary to prevent Castellano from destroying the organization through his cooperation with federal investigators, an allegation which most analysts have concluded was fabricated to justify the unsanctioned hit. The circumstances leading to Castellano's assassination had been developing for months. Agnello Della Croce, the underboss who had led the traditionalist faction within the Gambino family and who had served as a counterweight to Castellano's authority, had died of cancer On the 2nd of December 1985, just 14 days before the Sparks shooting, Della Croce's death removed the one figure within the family whose authority Gotti respected and whose presence had prevented an open conflict between the Castellano and Gotti factions. Within days of Della Croce's death, Gotti began planning the assassination with several co-conspirators, including Salvatore Gravano, a capo who controlled crews in Brooklyn, and Frank De Chico, a Castellano loyalist who agreed to participate in the plot. The decision to murder Castellano violated fundamental rules of La Cosa Nostra. Mafia protocol required that the assassination of a boss be approved by the commission, precisely to prevent the kind of unauthorized power grabs which had characterized the gang wars of the 1920s and 1930s. Gotti had made no effort to seek such approval, calculating that the other families would accept his assumption of power as a fait accompli once Castellano was dead, particularly given that the Gambino family was the largest and most powerful of the 5 families, and that challenging Gotti would risk igniting a broader conflict. The gamble succeeded in the immediate term. The other family bosses, while privately disapproving of Gotti's violation of protocol, raised no objections to his leadership of the Gambino organization. Vincent Gigante of the Genovese family and Antonio Corallo of the Lucchese family both recognized that moving against Gotti would create instability at a time when federal prosecutions were already threatening the families, and the potential costs of a war outweighed the benefits of enforcing commission rules. However, the assassination provided federal investigators with additional evidence for their developing cases. The FBI had been conducting surveillance on various Gambino family locations in the weeks leading up to the shooting, and several bugs had captured conversations in which Gotti and his associates discussed their dissatisfaction with Castellano's leadership. While none of these recordings contained explicit references to planning a murder, they established the existence of tensions within the family and Gotti's ambitions to assume control. When combined with witness testimony gathered in subsequent years, these recordings would contribute to the evidence used to prosecute Gotti for ordering the Castellano hit. More significantly, Gotti's personality and leadership style made him a far more vulnerable target than Castellano had been. Where Castellano had been cautious and publicity-averse, conducting business discreetly and avoiding unnecessary attention, Gotti actively courted media coverage and cultivated a public persona as a powerful and charismatic mob boss. He dressed in expensive suits, ate at prominent restaurants, and held court at the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy, where reporters and photographers regularly gathered to document his comings and goings. The tabloid press dubbed him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don, the latter nickname referencing his success in avoiding criminal convictions despite multiple prosecutions. This flamboyance violated decades of mafia tradition, which emphasized operating in the shadows and maintaining a low profile. Other bosses had gone to extraordinary lengths to avoid identification by law enforcement, with Vincent Gigante feigning mental illness and Antonio Corallo conducting business from his car to avoid surveillance. Gotti's opposite approach made him an easy target for FBI surveillance and created numerous opportunities for agents to document his activities and associations. In the months following his assumption of control, Gotti restructured the Gambino family's leadership. Frank De Chico was appointed underboss as a reward for his participation in the Castellano assassination, while Gravano was elevated to consigliere and later to underboss after De Chico was killed by a car bomb in April 1986, an attack which most investigators attributed to the Genovese family in retaliation for the unsanctioned Castellano hit. Joseph Armoni, a senior capo, was named consigliere, and various other positions within the family hierarchy were filled with Gotti loyalists from the Bergen crew and allied factions. Under Gotti's leadership, the Gambino family continued to generate substantial revenues from construction industry racketeering, labor union infiltration, loan sharking, and illegal gambling operations. However, Gotti also oversaw an expansion of the family's involvement in drug trafficking, an activity which Castellano had officially prohibited, but which had been widespread among the family's street-level crews. The increased focus on narcotics brought additional law enforcement attention and created new opportunities for federal prosecutors to bring charges under drug statutes in addition to RICO violations. The FBI's New York office responded to Gotti's ascension by intensifying its surveillance of Gambino family operations. The C-16 squad, which had been targeting the family since the late 1970s, received additional resources and personnel to focus specifically on Gotti and his closest associates. Agents began planning operations to install listening devices at the Ravenite Social Club and at an apartment above the club, which Gotti used for private meetings, locations which would prove critical to gathering evidence in subsequent years. Simultaneously, the broader commission case was proceeding toward trial. The indictments returned on the 25th of February 1985 had charged Anthony Salerno of the Genovese family, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, Antonio Corallo of the Lucchese family, and several other senior figures with operating a criminal enterprise through the commission. The indictment specified numerous predicate acts, including the murders of Carmine Galante and Bonanno family boss Cesare Bonventre, the concrete industry bid rigging scheme, and various acts of extortion and labor racketeering spanning more than a decade. The defendants retained prominent criminal defense attorneys who immediately began challenging the prosecution's theory of the case. The defense argued that the commission, if it existed at all, was simply an informal forum for discussion among family leaders rather than a criminal enterprise, and that charging defendants with participating in the commission violated their constitutional rights to free association. Additionally, defense attorneys challenged the admissibility of much of the electronic surveillance evidence, arguing that the applications for wiretap authorizations had been based on insufficient probable cause and that some of the recordings had been obtained in violation of the defendant's Fourth Amendment rights. These legal challenges occupied much of 1985 and early 1986 as prosecutors and defense attorneys filed motions and counter-motions in federal court. Judge Richard Owen, who was assigned to preside over the case, heard extensive arguments about the scope of RICO and the legal standards governing electronic surveillance before ruling that the case could proceed to trial. The judge's decisions largely favored the prosecution, finding that the commission could indeed be prosecuted as a criminal enterprise under RICO, and that the surveillance evidence had been lawfully obtained, though he did exclude certain recordings and impose limits on how some evidence could be presented to the jury while the legal maneuvering was ongoing. prosecutors continued to develop additional evidence and prepare witnesses for trial. The prosecution team reviewed thousands of pages of transcripts from wiretaps and bugs, identifying the most incriminating conversations and preparing summaries which would help jurors understand the context of specific statements. Cooperating witnesses, including Angelo Leonardo and several lower-ranking family members who had agreed to testify, were interviewed repeatedly to ensure their testimony would be clear and consistent. The defense likewise prepared extensively, with attorneys conducting their own investigations into the backgrounds of cooperating witnesses to identify inconsistencies or credibility issues which could be exploited during cross-examination. The defendants themselves, despite facing potential life sentences, appeared confident that their attorneys would succeed in undermining the prosecution's case, particularly given the complexity of the RICO statute and the novelty of prosecuting the Commission as an entity. The assassination had provided the FBI with additional evidence of RICO violations, as the murder itself constituted a predicate act of the criminal enterprise, and meanwhile, Gotti's assumption of leadership placed an impulsive and media-hungry individual at the helm of America's most powerful crime family at precisely the moment when federal prosecutors were preparing their most comprehensive assault on the mafia. The contrast between the cautious, businesslike approach of the previous generation of bosses and Gotti's flamboyant style would prove significant in the years to come, as investigators exploited his visibility and his tendency to discuss family business in locations where conversations could be recorded. As the investigation into Castellano's murder was proceeding through 1986, the broader commission case, which had been years in development, was finally ready to proceed to trial. On the 25th of February, 1985, 9 months before Castellano's assassination, federal prosecutors had unsealed indictments against the bosses of 4 of the 5 families, charging them with operating a criminal enterprise through the commission. The defendants named in the indictment were Anthony Salerno and Anthony Indelicato of the Genovese family, Carmine Persico and Gennaro Langella of the Colombo family, Antonio Corallo, Salvatore Santoro and Christopher Furnari of the Lucchese family, and Ralph Scopo, a soldier who controlled a concrete workers' union local. Philip Rastelli of the Bonanno family was indicted separately in a related case, while the Gambino family was not included in the initial commission indictment due to ongoing investigations, which would eventually target both Castellano and later Gotti. The indictment specified a pattern of racketeering activity spanning from 1980 to 1985, though prosecutors asserted that the criminal enterprise itself had existed since the 1930s. The predicate acts listed in the charging document included the murders of Carmine Galante, who'd been killed in 1979, and Dominic Napolitano, a Bonanno family capo, murdered in 1981 for his role in vouching for FBI agent Joseph Pistone. Additionally, the indictment charged the defendants with operating the concrete club bid rigging scheme, extorting construction companies, infiltrating labor unions, and coordinating criminal activities across family lines through commission meetings. The trial began on the 8th of September 1986 in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York with jury selection. Judge Richard Owen presided over the proceedings, which were held in a heavily secured courtroom due to concerns about witness intimidation and potential violence. The prosecution team was led by Michael Chertoff, with assistance from John Savarese and Gil Childers, while the defendants were represented by a group of prominent criminal defense attorneys, including James LaRosa, Samuel Dawson, and Barry Slotnick. In his opening statement, Chertoff outlined the government's theory that the commission functioned as the board of directors of a criminal organization which existed to coordinate illegal activities, resolve disputes, and enforce rules among the 5 families. He explained that the defendants would be proven guilty not merely because they had committed specific crimes, but because they had participated in an ongoing conspiracy to operate this criminal enterprise through a pattern of racketeering activity. The prosecution would demonstrate this participation through electronic surveillance recordings, testimony from cooperating witnesses, and documentary evidence showing the defendants' roles within their respective families and on the commission. The defense attorneys responded by attacking the credibility of the government's cooperating witnesses and arguing that the commission, if it existed at all, was simply an informal social organization rather than a criminal conspiracy. They contended that conversations captured on surveillance devices were ambiguous and subject to multiple interpretations, and that prosecutors were attempting to criminalize legitimate business activities and normal social interactions among Italian Americans. Several defense attorneys also argued that their clients were being prosecuted simply for being leaders within their communities, rather than for committing any specific criminal acts. Over the following weeks, prosecutors presented extensive evidence to the jury. The Jaguar bug tapes were played in court, with jurors hearing Antonio Corallo discuss commission meetings, the concrete bid rigging arrangements, and various family matters in conversations with his underboss Salvatore Santoro and other associates. FBI agents who had conducted surveillance testified about observing defendants meeting together at various locations, while experts explained the structure of La Cosa Nostra and the function of the commission in governing the families. Angelo Leonardo, the former underboss of the Cleveland crime family, provided testimony about his own attendance at commission meetings and his understanding of how the governing body functioned. He described the commission as the final authority on disputes between families, explained the process by which murders of maid members had to be approved by the commission, and detailed specific meetings at which he had been present alongside several of the defendants. Under cross-examination, defense attorneys attempted to discredit Leonardo by highlighting his own extensive criminal history and suggesting that he was testifying in exchange for lenient treatment. But Leonardo maintained that his testimony was truthful despite his personal motivations for cooperating. Additional witnesses included Fred DeChristopher, a contractor who testified about being forced to pay bribes to concrete workers, union officials controlled by the families, in order to work on construction projects in Manhattan. DeChristopher explained the mechanics of the concrete club, describing how bids were coordinated to ensure that family-connected companies received contracts and how companies which refused to participate were subjected to labor problems and other forms of intimidation. His testimony provided concrete examples of how the racketeering conspiracy operated in practice and how the defendants profited from their control of legitimate industries. Documentary evidence presented by prosecutors included union records showing the defendants' control over various labor organizations, financial records demonstrating payments to family members through no-show jobs and consulting contracts, and surveillance photographs showing defendants meeting together at locations throughout New York. Prosecutors also introduced evidence of specific murders which had been committed as part of the racketeering conspiracy, including autopsy reports, crime scene photographs, and testimony from investigators who had worked on the homicide cases. The defense called few witnesses, instead focusing their efforts on cross-examining the government's witnesses and arguing in summation that prosecutors had failed to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. Defense attorneys emphasized the complexity of the RICO statute and suggested that jurors should be skeptical of attempting to hold defendants criminally liable for participating in an alleged enterprise rather than for committing specific criminal acts, which could be clearly proven. The jury began deliberations on the 13th of November 1986 after receiving instructions from Judge Owen on the legal standards governing RICO prosecutions and the requirements for finding the defendants guilty. The deliberations continued for 5 days as jurors reviewed transcripts of the surveillance recordings and debated the evidence presented during the trial. On the 19th of November 1986, the jury returned verdicts finding all 8 defendants guilty on all counts. The convictions represented the first time in American history that the leadership of multiple organized crime families had been convicted simultaneously under the RICO statute for operating a criminal enterprise. Sentencing hearings were held in January 1987. Judge Owen sentenced Anthony Salerno, Antonio Corallo, and Carmine Persico each to 100 years in federal prison, effectively life sentences for the elderly defendants. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 40 years to 100 years, with the exact terms determined by their specific roles in the conspiracy and their criminal histories. All of the defendants were ordered to forfeit assets derived from their criminal activities, though calculating the precise value of such assets proved difficult given the decades over which the enterprise had operated. The commission case convictions represented the first time in history that the leadership of multiple mafia families had been convicted simultaneously under RICO, but the federal government's assault on La Cosa Nostra was far from complete. Even as the commission defendants were being sentenced in early 1987, separate investigative efforts targeting John Gotti and the Gambino family were intensifying, with prosecutors determined to bring down the man who had by this time become the most recognizable mob figure in America. John Joseph Gotti Jr., who had assumed control of the Gambino family in the aftermath of Paul Castellano's assassination, proved to be a far more difficult target for federal prosecutors than the commission defendants had been. Between 1986 and 1990, Gotti was prosecuted 3 times on various charges and secured acquittals in each case, earning the nickname Teflon Don from the media, due to his apparent imperviousness to criminal convictions. The first trial, which began in August 1986, involved charges of assault and conspiracy related to the shooting of a union official and ended in acquittal after defense attorneys successfully argued that the prosecution's witnesses were unreliable. The second prosecution, beginning in January 1987, charged Gotti with racketeering and conspiracy, but similarly ended in acquittal in March 1987 after the jury accepted defense arguments that the government had failed to prove its case beyond a reasonable doubt. These repeated acquittals frustrated federal prosecutors and FBI investigators who were convinced of Gotti's guilt but unable to secure convictions. Analysis of the trial suggested that jurors were reluctant to credit testimony from cooperating witnesses who had their own extensive criminal histories, and that Gotti's charismatic courtroom presence and expensive legal representation were effective in creating reasonable doubt. Additionally, there were suggestions, never proven conclusively, that jury tampering may have occurred in at least one of the trials, with defense associates allegedly making contact with jurors to influence their deliberations. The FBI responded to these setbacks by intensifying surveillance of Gotti and the Gambino family. In late 1989, agents succeeded in obtaining court authorization to install listening devices at the Ravenite Social Club at 247 Mulberry Street in Little Italy, where Gotti maintained his headquarters, and in an apartment above the club, which Gotti used for private meetings with his underboss and other senior family members. The bugs were installed during overnight operations while the locations were empty, with agents carefully concealing the devices to avoid detection. Over the following months, the Ravenite bugs captured extensive conversations in which Gotti discussed family business, including his involvement in ordering murders, his control of labor unions, his management of the family's criminal operations, and his criticisms of various subordinates. Critically, the recordings included conversations in which Gotti disparaged his underboss, Salvatore Gravano, suggesting that Gravano was not sufficiently aggressive in defending family interests and complaining about various decisions Gravano had made. These recordings would later prove instrumental in convincing Gravano to cooperate with federal authorities. Salvatore Gravano, known as Sammy the Bull, had been elevated to underboss following the death of Frank DeCicco in 1986 and had become one of Gotti's most trusted associates. Gravano controlled extensive construction industry rackets in Brooklyn and Staten Island and had participated in numerous murders on behalf of the family, including the Castellano assassination. However, Gravano was also a pragmatist who recognized that Gotti's flamboyant leadership style was attracting excessive law enforcement attention and making the family vulnerable to prosecution. On the 11th of December 1990, Gotti, Gravano, and Frank Locascio, the family consigliere, were arrested by FBI agents as they left the Ravenite Social Club. The arrests were based on evidence gathered from the bugs installed at the club, and the defendants were charged under RICO with conspiracy, murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and tax evasion. The indictment specified 13 separate murders, including those of Paul Castellano and Thomas Bellotti, as predicate acts of racketeering. Gravano was held without bail and faced the prospect of spending the remainder of his life in prison if convicted. In the months following his arrest, federal prosecutors played selected recordings from the Ravenite bugs for Gravano and his attorney, including the conversations in which Gotti criticized Gravano and questioned his loyalty. The recordings convinced Gravano that Gotti would likely attempt to shift blame onto him at trial, portraying Gravano as the primary decision-maker for various criminal activities, while Gotti claimed ignorance or lack of direct involvement. In November 1991, after nearly a year of negotiations with prosecutors, Gravano agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for a reduced sentence. The decision made him the highest-ranking member of La Cosa Nostra to become a government witness up to that time, and his defection dealt a devastating blow to Gotti's defense strategy. Gravano's cooperation agreement required him to plead guilty to his own role in 19 murders and to testify truthfully about the Gambino family's operations and Gotti's leadership. The trial of John Gotti began in January 1992 in federal court in Brooklyn. The prosecution team was led by John Gleason, an assistant United States attorney who had spent years building cases against the Gambino family. Gleason's opening statement outlined a comprehensive case based on the Ravenite surveillance tapes, Gravano's testimony, and documentary evidence showing Gotti's control of the family. The strategy was to prove not merely that Gotti had committed specific crimes, but that he had operated the Gambino family as a criminal enterprise in violation of RICO. Gravano took the witness stand in early March 1992 and testified for 9 days about his involvement with the Gambino family and his relationship with Gotti. He provided detailed accounts of the planning and execution of the Castellano murder, described numerous other killings in which he and Gotti had participated, and explained the structure and operations of the family in meticulous detail. Under cross-examination by Gotti's attorney Albert Krieger, Gravano acknowledged his extensive criminal history and admitted to committing acts of extreme violence. But he maintained that his testimony about Gotti's role in the family's criminal activities was accurate. The prosecution also played extensive excerpts from the Ravenite tapes, allowing jurors to hear Gotti in his own words discussing criminal activities and demonstrating his control over the family. The recordings corroborated Gravano's testimony on numerous points and provided compelling evidence that Gotti was not merely a member of the Gambino organization, but its undisputed leader. The jury began deliberations on the 24th of March 1992 and returned guilty verdicts on all counts on the 2nd of April 1992. Gotti was convicted of 13 counts of murder, conspiracy to commit murder, loan sharking, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, bribery, and tax evasion. On the 23rd of June 1992, Judge Avai Leo Glasser sentenced Gotti to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Gotti was subsequently transferred to the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, a maximum security facility where he was held in solitary confinement for 23 hours per day. Gotti's conviction effectively ended the Gambino family's dominance of New York's organized crime landscape, and with the commission bosses and now Gotti imprisoned for life, the power structure of La Cosa Nostra had been fundamentally dismantled. In the years immediately following Gotti's conviction, federal prosecutors continued to pursue remaining members of the five families with increasing success. The convictions secured in the commission case and the Gotti prosecution had demonstrated the effectiveness of RICO when combined with electronic surveillance and cooperating witnesses, and federal prosecutors now applied these methods systematically to the remaining leadership of the five families. Vincent Gigante, who had directed the Genovese family while maintaining his elaborate pretense of mental illness, continued to evade prosecution throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s by appearing in public wearing bathrobes and pajamas, shuffling through the streets of Greenwich Village while muttering incoherently. Defense attorneys had successfully used this behavior to argue that Gigante was incompetent to stand trial on multiple occasions, with psychiatrists testifying that he suffered from severe mental illness which prevented him from understanding the charges against him or assisting in his own defense. However, FBI surveillance operations had captured extensive evidence that Gigante's apparent mental incapacity was a performance rather than a genuine condition. Bugs installed at locations in Little Italy recorded Gigante conducting family business in clear and cogent language, discussing criminal activities, issuing orders to subordinates, and demonstrating complete awareness of his surroundings and circumstances. Additionally, surveillance teams observed Gigante behaving normally when he believed he was not being watched, only to resume his shuffling and muttering when he entered public spaces or locations where he might encounter law enforcement. Prosecutors compiled this evidence and in 1990 obtained an indictment charging Gigante with racketeering, conspiracy, and murder. Legal proceedings extended for years as defense attorneys continued to assert that Gigante was mentally incompetent. But in 1997, Judge Eugene Nickerson ruled that the evidence demonstrated Gigante was feigning his condition and that he was competent to stand trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of a trial at which his deception would be exposed, Gigante pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice and admitted that he had been fabricating his mental illness for decades to avoid prosecution. He was sentenced to 12 years in federal prison and died while incarcerated in 2005 at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. The Colombo family continued to suffer from internal conflicts and prosecutions throughout the 1990s, with multiple members convicted under RICO for various criminal activities, including murder, extortion, and labor racketeering. Victor Orena and Alphonse Persico, competing claimants to leadership of the family following Carmine Persico's imprisonment, were both convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment in the mid-1990s, effectively leaving the family leaderless and fragmenting its operations into independent crews with limited coordination. The Lucchese family likewise faced systematic prosecution following Antonio Corallo's conviction in the commission case. Victor Amuso, who assumed leadership after Corallo's imprisonment, was convicted in 1992 of 54 counts of racketeering, including participation in 9 murders, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. His underboss, Anthony Casso, who had initially evaded arrest by going into hiding, was captured in 1993 and later became a cooperating witness, though his cooperation agreement was eventually revoked by prosecutors who determined that he had continued to commit crimes and lie to investigators, even while supposedly assisting the government. The most significant defection among family bosses occurred within the Bonanno organization. Joseph Charles Massino, who had controlled the family since the early 1990s following Philip Rastelli's death, was arrested in 2003 and charged with 7 murders, arson, extortion, loan sharking, and illegal gambling under RICO. Facing the prospect of the death penalty for one of the murders, which involved the killing of a Bonanno family capo on Massino's orders, he agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in 2004, becoming the first boss of one of the 5 families to testify for the government, while still officially holding his position. Massino's cooperation was motivated in part by the recognition that the code of silence, which had traditionally governed La Cosa Nostra, had been irreparably broken by the numerous defections which had occurred since Gravano's decision to testify against Gotti. Massino provided extensive information about the structure and operations of the Bonanno family and testified in multiple prosecutions against other organized crime figures. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors agreed not to seek the death penalty, and Massino was sentenced to life imprisonment, though he avoided being sent to a maximum security facility and was instead housed in protective custody, where cooperating witnesses served their sentences separated from the general prison population. The wave of prosecutions which followed the Commission case convictions resulted in over 1,000 arrests and hundreds of convictions of organized crime figures in New York between 1985 and 2005. The systematic use of RICO, electronic surveillance, and cooperating witnesses had proven devastatingly effective in dismantling the organizational structures which had allowed La Cosa Nostra to operate with relative impunity for decades. Family hierarchies were disrupted as bosses, underbosses, and consiglieri were imprisoned, and younger members proved increasingly unwilling to assume leadership positions given the near certainty of eventual prosecution and lengthy imprisonment. The erosion of omerta, the code of silence, which had been the foundation of La Cosa Nostra's power, accelerated dramatically in the 1990s and early 2000s, where cooperation with law enforcement had once been virtually unthinkable and punishable by death. It became an increasingly common response to arrest and prosecution as members calculated that loyalty to the organization would result in life imprisonment, while cooperation offered the possibility of reduced sentences and witness protection. Consequently, by the early 2000s, the organizational structure which had dominated New York's underworld for over half a century had been reduced to scattered crews engaging in street-level criminal activity, a far cry from the powerful criminal enterprise which had controlled billions of dollars in illegal revenue 2 decades earlier. In the aftermath of these prosecutions, both the mafia families themselves and the city of New York underwent significant transformations which reflected the diminished power of organized crime. The 5 families continue to exist in attenuated form in contemporary New York, but their influence and operational capabilities bear little resemblance to their dominance in the 1970s and 1980s. Law enforcement estimates suggest that the combined membership of all 5 families has declined from over 3,000 made members and associates in 1985 to fewer than 1,000 active participants today, with many of those remaining engaged primarily in small-scale criminal activities rather than the sophisticated racketeering operations which characterized the organizations at their peak. The types of operations still conducted by family members reflect this diminished status. Traditional activities such as illegal gambling, loan sharking, and extortion continue on a limited basis, but the extensive control over construction, garbage collection, labor unions, and legitimate industries, which defined the family's power in previous decades, has been largely eliminated. Periodic prosecutions in the 2010s and 2020s have resulted in convictions of acting bosses and senior members, demonstrating that the families retain some organizational structure, but the sentences imposed and the scale of the criminal activities involved indicate that these are remnants of once powerful organizations rather than the formidable enterprises they had been. The younger generation of Italian Americans has shown marked reluctance to enter what members refer to as the life. recognizing that participation in organized crime now carries near certain risks of imprisonment without the substantial financial rewards which attracted previous generations. The systematic use of RICO prosecutions, the prevalence of electronic surveillance, and the routine cooperation of arrested members have made organized crime an extremely dangerous and unprofitable career choice. Additionally, the assimilation of Italian Americans into mainstream American society has provided legitimate economic opportunities which did not exist for earlier generations, reducing the appeal of criminal enterprise. The epidemic of cooperation, which began with Salvatore Gravano's defection, has continued unabated, with arrested members regularly choosing to testify against their associates rather than face lengthy prison sentences. This development has fundamentally undermined the organizational cohesion which once characterized La Cosa Nostra, as members can no longer trust that their confederates will maintain silence when arrested. The traditional mechanisms for enforcing omerta through violence have become less effective when potential witnesses can be placed in witness protection programs which provide new identities and relocation far from New York. The reduction in mafia influence has been accompanied by the rise of other organized crime groups which have moved to fill the vacuum left by the weakened Italian-American families. Russian organized crime groups, Albanian criminal organizations, and various Asian gangs have established operations in New York, often engaging in the same types of activities which the five families once dominated. However, these newer organizations have generally avoided the centralized hierarchical structures which made the mafia vulnerable to RICO prosecutions, instead operating through loose networks of associates which are more difficult for law enforcement to target systematically. New York's crime statistics reflect the impact of diminished organized crime influence. Neighborhoods in Brooklyn, Queens, and Manhattan, which experienced high rates of violence during the 1980s and early 1990s, have seen substantial reductions in homicides and other violent crimes. While numerous factors have contributed to these improvements, including changes in policing strategies and economic development, the removal of organized crime's destabilizing influence has played a significant role. The elimination of turf wars between families and the reduction in murders related to internal family conflicts have contributed to overall declines in the city's murder rate. The FBI's organized crime squads in New York have been substantially reduced in size and resources compared to their peak in the 1980s and 1990s. Following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, federal law enforcement priorities shifted dramatically toward counterterrorism, and agents who had previously focused on investigating organized crime were reassigned to terrorism-related cases, while the FBI maintains units dedicated to monitoring the remnants of the five families and pursuing ongoing criminal activities. The scale of these efforts represents a fraction of the resources once devoted to combating La Cosa Nostra. The RICO statute, which proved so effective in dismantling the mafia families, has been applied extensively in other contexts since the Commission case established its utility. Federal prosecutors have used RICO to target street gangs, drug trafficking organizations, white-collar criminals, and even corrupt police departments and political organizations. Some civil liberties advocates and legal scholars have raised concerns about the broad application of RICO beyond its original purpose of combating organized crime. But the statute remains a powerful tool in federal prosecutions. Today, New York City benefits from significantly reduced organized crime influence, with violent crime rates in neighborhoods once plagued by mafia control having decreased substantially, a development which can be directly traced to the systematic prosecutions which began with the Commission case in 1985. The success of federal prosecutors in dismantling the five families raises questions about the methods employed, the costs of these victories, and whether the ends justified the means. The Federal Bureau of Investigation and federal prosecutors achieved something unprecedented in American law enforcement history by systematically dismantling the leadership of La Cosa Nostra. But the methods employed and the broader implications of this campaign warrant examination. The achievements of the prosecutions are substantial and measurable. Federal authorities succeeded in ending decades of impunity for organized crime figures who had operated with minimal interference from law enforcement, controlling entire industries and corrupting labor unions, businesses, and government officials. The systematic application of the RICO statute demonstrated that even sophisticated criminal organizations with extensive resources and political connections could be prosecuted successfully when investigators and prosecutors committed sufficient time and resources to building comprehensive cases. The reduction in mafia influence over legitimate industries has saved businesses and consumers billions of dollars in inflated costs and extortion payments, while neighborhoods once plagued by organized crime violence have experienced significant improvements in public safety. Additionally, the prosecutions proved that the code of silence which had protected La Cosa Nostra for generations could be broken through strategic use of cooperating witnesses and electronic surveillance. The willingness of high-ranking members such as Salvatore Gravano and Joseph Massino to testify against their former associates demonstrated that omerta was not an unbreakable cultural tradition, but rather a pragmatic arrangement which collapsed when members calculated that cooperation offered better outcomes than loyalty to the organization. However, the costs and compromises inherent in these prosecutions raise legitimate concerns. The extensive electronic surveillance operations, which provided crucial evidence in the Commission case and subsequent prosecutions, required invasive monitoring of private conversations over extended periods, raising questions about the balance between effective law enforcement and constitutional protections against unreasonable searches. While courts consistently approved the surveillance applications and found that the bugs and wiretaps were lawfully authorized, civil liberties advocates have argued that the precedents set by these cases have contributed to an expansion of government surveillance powers, which extends far beyond organized crime investigations. The reliance on cooperating witnesses who received reduced sentences in exchange for testimony presents additional ethical complexities. Salvatore Gravano, who admitted to participating in 19 murders, served only 5 years in federal prison before being released into the Witness Protection Program, a sentence which many observers regarded as grossly disproportionate to his crimes. The government's willingness to offer such favorable terms to violent criminals in order to secure convictions of their superiors established a pattern which has been replicated in countless subsequent prosecutions, creating a system in which the most culpable defendants often receive the lightest sentences by agreeing to testify against others. The question of whether new criminal organizations simply filled the void left by the weakened mafia families also merits consideration. While the five families' influence has been dramatically reduced, Russian, Albanian, and Asian organized crime groups have established operations in many of the same sectors which the mafia once controlled. These newer organizations often operate with greater violence and less adherence to traditional rules than the Italian-American families, suggesting that the prosecution succeeded in eliminating a specific criminal organization, but did not eliminate the underlying market for illegal goods and services, which sustains organized crime. It could be argued that the mafia families would have declined significantly even without the aggressive prosecutions of the 1980s and 1990s. The assimilation of Italian Americans into mainstream society, the generational changes which made organized crime less appealing to younger individuals, and broader economic shifts which reduced the profitability of traditional rackets, all contributed to weakening the families. Whether federal prosecutions accelerated an inevitable decline or were the primary cause of the mafia's collapse remains a subject of debate among scholars who study organized crime. The expansion of RICO's application beyond organized crime to target corporations, political organizations, and protest groups has generated controversy about whether the statute has been used in ways its authors did not intend. Some legal scholars have argued that RICO's broad language and severe penalties make it a tool which prosecutors can deploy against virtually any organization engaged in controversial activities, potentially criminalizing legitimate business practices and political advocacy. While organized crime prosecutions under RICO enjoy broad public support, the same statute's use against other targets has proven far more contentious. The reality is that the FBI's campaign against the five families succeeded in breaking the power of La Cosa Nostra in New York through a combination of sophisticated investigative techniques, aggressive use of RICO, and strategic deployment of cooperating witnesses. Whether this success came at an acceptable cost in terms of civil liberties, ethical compromises, and the precedents established for government surveillance and prosecutorial practices remains a matter on which reasonable observers disagree. What do you think of the FBI's methods in taking down the mafia bosses? Were the extensive surveillance operations and deals with cooperating murderers justified by the results? Or did the government overstep acceptable boundaries in its pursuit of organized crime? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.